The storm hit the mountain like a sudden punch, sharp and cold, catching Ethan Walker completely off guard as he pulled up to his late father's old cabin, a place he hadn't visited since the funeral, a place filled with ghosts he wasn't ready to face. He had come only to pack boxes, sign papers, and leave before memories had a chance to breathe, but as he stepped out of his truck, thick white snow was already falling sideways, pushed hard by the wind. Inside the cabin he found Claire, his father's widow, standing near the dusty shelves with a cardboard box in her hands. Their eyes met for a second that felt too long, a mix of unresolved tension, shared grief, and the awkwardness of two people tied together by someone who was no longer alive. Claire, usually calm, looked worried as the storm grew louder, and Ethan could see her trying to hide it. She had driven up earlier that morning to gather her things, not knowing Ethan would arrive the same day. Neither planned this. Neither wanted this. And yet the storm kept tightening around the cabin like a closing fist. The lights flickered once, then again, and finally died completely, plunging the cabin into a dim gray twilight that made every shadow seem alive. The heater groaned a final low hum before going silent. The temperature dropped fast, sinking into the floorboards, climbing up their legs, filling the air with a cold that pressed against skin like a warning. Ethan tried the generator. It wheezed, sputtered, and died, leaving them with only a fireplace that wouldn't start and a pile of blankets that smelled faintly of cedar and old summers. Snow hammered the windows, and the wind wailed like a siren across the frozen trees. Claire wrapped her arms around herself, shivering as she stared out the window at the whiteout forming outside. "We might be stuck here," she said, voice thin. Ethan didn't answer. He didn't know what to say. They were practically strangers, connected only through marriage papers and a few stiff conversations at family dinners. After his father died, Ethan had kept his distance, unsure how to deal with any of it. His grief, hers, or the complicated silence between them. Hours passed, and the cabin grew colder. Batteries died. The last orange glow from the fireplace attempt faded into black. Ethan checked the weather radio, but all he heard was static. The storm wasn't going anywhere tonight. Claire's hands trembled as she sat on the edge of the couch, pulling the blanket tighter around her shoulders. Her lips were pale. She was trying not to show how cold she was, but Ethan saw it anyway. Finally, she spoke, barely above a whisper, as if afraid the wind might hear. "Ethan, we're losing heat too fast. We need to share a blanket. It's the only way to stay warm long enough." The words hung in the air, strange and heavy, not inappropriate, just necessary, but still complicated. Ethan felt something tight twist inside him, not attraction, not discomfort, but the emotional weight of being forced this close to a piece of his father's life he had never understood. He didn't want to be here. He didn't want to feel anything. But he also didn't want either of them to freeze. He nodded once, short and stiff. No discussion. No argument. Just survival. They settled on the old cabin couch, wrapping themselves in the thick, worn blanket. Not touching much, only enough to share warmth. Their breaths came out in thin clouds. The storm raged harder, and the windows rattled like bones in the wind. In that tight space, Ethan could feel every unspoken word between them. Claire's breathing was uneven, not from fear but from the emotional weight of everything they had never said. Ethan stared at the dark fireplace, fighting the memories pressing at the back of his mind. His father's laugh, his father's mistakes, the distance that never closed. Claire finally broke the silence with a soft voice that didn't try to fix anything, didn't try to reach too far. "Your father loved this place. He wanted it to be a bridge between you two." Ethan swallowed hard. "He didn't know how to build bridges," he said quietly, the truth slipping out before he could stop it. Claire's eyes softened, but she didn't argue. Instead, she said something he didn't expect. "Maybe he hoped I could help." Her voice wasn't defensive. It wasn't emotional. It was honest. And the simplicity of it cracked something open inside him, something he had held shut for years. They stayed like that, wrapped in silence and fading warmth. Two people who didn't choose each other but were now facing the same storm, inside and out. Ethan didn't know what tomorrow would look like or how long the blizzard would last. But he did know this night was forcing him to face things he had run from for too long. As the wind roared and the cabin trembled, and the blanket held what little heat they had left, Ethan suddenly understood, with a quiet heaviness, that the storm outside wasn't the only one he'd have to survive. The night dragged on as the cold grew sharper, forcing Ethan and Claire to stay under the blanket even though neither of them felt comfortable sharing such close space. And when morning crept into the cabin, it brought no warmth, only a dull gray light that made everything look tired and worn. They were both stiff from sitting on the couch all night, shoulders aching, feet numb. But neither complained because there was no energy left for that, only the simple need to get through whatever this day would bring. Ethan stood first, rubbing his hands together and trying to get some feeling back, while Claire quietly folded one side of the blanket as if tidying it would somehow restore order to the situation. The storm outside hadn't ended. The wind still whipped against the windows, and snow piled high against the porch, trapping them without a clear way out. The radio was silent except for weak static, and their phones had no signal, leaving the cabin cut off from everyone else. As Ethan looked around, he felt the cold inside his chest more than the cold in the room. This cabin was supposed to be a place of memories, but for him it was a reminder of everything broken in his life. He kept telling himself he didn't care about Claire, that she was just the woman his father married late in life, someone he barely spoke to, someone who didn't really know him, but the storm had forced them to share the same air, the same silence, the same worry, and now he couldn't avoid her or avoid the fact that she too was hurting in her own quiet way. Claire finally spoke as she warmed her hands with her breath. "Last night, thank you. I know it wasn't easy." Her voice was soft, careful, as if she didn't want to step on anything fragile. Ethan shrugged, trying to sound distant. "We did what we had to." But the truth was more complicated, and he knew it. Survival had forced them closer, but the closeness had forced open the door to emotions he didn't want to inspect. Still, the cabin was freezing, and they had to work together whether they liked each other or not. While searching for anything useful, Ethan found a few candles, matches, and a couple of old lanterns that still had fuel. They lit the room with a soft golden glow, making the shadows move gently like they were breathing. Claire poured 2 cups of instant coffee using water warmed over a small portable stove Ethan found in a cabinet. It wasn't much, but the heat felt like a blessing, the steam rising like hope from something too simple to matter, but somehow mattered a lot. They sat close again, not touching this time, but near enough that their breaths fogged the same cold air. The silence between them wasn't as sharp as the night before. It felt slower, softer, almost peaceful. Claire wrapped her hands around her cup and said, "Your father wanted us to understand each other. He thought we could." Ethan stared into his coffee. He didn't know how to understand anyone. He tried maybe, but he wasn't good at it. Claire didn't defend him. Instead she said, "He talked about you all the time. He wished he had done better." The words hit Ethan hard. Not because they were dramatic, but because they sounded so plain and true. And for the first time, he wondered if maybe his father had felt the same distance, the same regret. Claire didn't look at him like she was trying to take his father's place or fix his pain. She looked at him like she was standing on the same side of a long road, trying to see the same horizon. Ethan didn't want to open up, but something inside him slipped. "I thought he forgot about me," he said quietly. "After he remarried, after everything. I thought he moved on." Claire shook her head, her eyes soft. "He didn't move on. He just didn't know how to reach back." The cabin seemed smaller after she said that, like the truth had filled the empty spaces between them. Ethan felt something loosen inside him, a tension he had held for years without even realizing it. But the moment didn't stay gentle for long. A deep shudder ran through the cabin as the wind slammed hard against the side wall, making Claire flinch and sending a gust of cold air sweeping across the room. The heater was dead, the fireplace still useless, and the cabin kept getting colder. Ethan checked the windows, the doors, and the battery supplies again, working with fast, clipped movements as if trying to outrun the rising pressure inside his chest. Claire watched him, quiet but present, not pushing him, not questioning him. Eventually, Ethan sat back down, rubbing his hands together. "We need more heat. The blanket won't be enough tonight." Claire nodded. "I know. But we'll manage." The way she said it wasn't optimistic. It was steady, reassuring, like a calm voice in a place where everything else was falling apart. He realized then that she wasn't helpless, not fragile. She was just grieving in a different way, trying to hold herself together while standing in the middle of the same storm he was. Time passed slowly, but in a way that pushed them forward, not backward. They talked about simple things. How long she had known his father, how she grew up near the coast, How Ethan used to spend summers fishing with his dad before everything fell apart. The stories weren't dramatic, but they felt real. And with each one, a little more of the wall between them crumbled. They weren't friends, not yet. They weren't family, not really. They were two people who had both loved the same man in different ways, two people trying to understand each other because the storm had taken away their distance. Afternoon passed into evening, and the dim golden candlelight filled the room again. The temperature dropped once more, sharper this time, biting through their layers of clothing. Claire shivered and tried to hide it, but the shaking in her hands gave her away. Ethan saw it immediately. "We can't do another night like this," he said. "We'll get sick. Or worse." Claire met his eyes, nervous but trusting. "Then what do we do?" Ethan didn't have an answer yet, and that scared him more than anything. He had always avoided this cabin, avoided her, avoided his father's memory, but now everything was trapped with him inside four wooden walls, and he had no choice but to face the cold and the truth together. The storm outside had not stopped, and inside the cabin, a different kind of storm was pushing both of them toward a deeper understanding, something uncomfortable but necessary. And as the night approached again, heavier and colder than the one before, Ethan realized they were running out of options, out of heat, out of time, and out of ways to keep avoiding the emotions the storm kept dragging into the open. The second night was coming, and neither of them knew what it would bring, only that they would have to face it side by side, whether they were ready or not. The storm eased only a little by the next morning, leaving the world outside buried in white and the cabin wrapped in a frozen silence that felt almost heavier than the wind from the night before. And Ethan stepped toward the small window, wiping the fog away with his sleeve as he tried to judge how bad things still were. He could see trees bent under the weight of ice, the mountain path completely erased, and snow stacked so high against the porch railing it looked like the cabin had sunk into the earth overnight. And he felt a knot tighten in his stomach because he knew they weren't getting down the mountain anytime soon. Claire sat at the table behind him, rubbing her hands together and blowing into them for warmth, doing her best to keep steady even though the cabin air was cold enough to make every breath sting. And when Ethan glanced back at her, he saw the tired lines on her face, the way her shoulders drooped, and he felt a strange mix of guilt and responsibility that he didn't know what to do with. He grabbed the radio again, hoping for a better signal, but all he heard was the same hollow static echoing through the speakers. No weather update, no rescue alert, nothing but the sound of the storm fading into an empty frequency. He turned the dial again and again, pushing harder, as if the force alone would make the world respond, but it didn't, not even once. Claire stood and stepped closer, placing her hands on the back of a chair to steady herself. "Maybe we try again later," she said softly. Ethan didn't answer because he suddenly heard something, a faint light tapping sound coming from the front door, too soft to be the wind, too steady to be a branch. He froze, listening harder. Claire looked up, confused. The tapping came again, a little louder this time, almost like knuckles against wood. Ethan moved toward the door slowly, unsure if the cold was making his mind play tricks, but the sound came again before he reached it, and that time it was unmistakable. He grabbed the handle, bracing himself for anything, a fallen tree, loose debris, even an animal, but when he pulled the door open, a freezing blast of wind swept into the room, followed by the silhouette of a woman standing in the swirling snow, her face half hidden behind a thick scarf, her eyes bright and familiar in a way that hit Ethan's memory like a spark touching a dry fuse. It was Lila Brooks, one of the local mountain rescue volunteers, the girl he had grown up with, laughed with, drifted apart from, and never really forgot, and seeing her standing there in the snow made something in him jolt awake. She pulled down her scarf and smiled, breath white in the air. "Ethan Walker," she said, shaking her head with a mix of surprise and relief. "I can't believe you're the one stuck up here." Ethan stepped aside so she could enter, and the moment she crossed the threshold the room seemed warmer somehow, even though the temperature hadn't changed at all. Lila brushed the snow off her coat, her cheeks flushed from the cold, her brown hair tucked under a wool cap, and when she looked around the dim cabin, taking in the candles, the bundled blankets, the cold haze, she gave Ethan a knowing, half-amused look. "Long night?" she asked. "Too long," he replied. Claire approached from behind, offering a polite smile as she introduced herself, and Lila nodded respectfully. "I came up when we heard someone had been in the area before the storm hit," Lila explained, setting her backpack down. "Didn't know it was two people. Roads are blocked, radio towers are down. but I figured I could get close enough on foot to check on whoever was up here." Ethan frowned. "On foot? In this weather?" Lila shrugged, her smile warm and steady. "Someone had to try." She said it so simply, like hiking through a dangerous snowstorm with no guarantee of finding anyone alive was just another chore on her weekend list. And Ethan felt that old familiar admiration stirring again. The same admiration he'd felt years ago when they were teenagers climbing rocks by the river or racing bikes down the hill into town. Claire stepped back, giving Ethan and Lila space without making it obvious, like she could sense something in the room even though no words had been exchanged yet. Lila unzipped her backpack and pulled out a small, portable emergency heater, a lamp and a few sealed food packs, placing them on the table like she was unloading treasure. Ethan looked at the heater as if it were a miracle. "It's battery-powered," Lila explained. "Won't last forever, but long enough to keep us from freezing." Ethan helped her set it up, and when the first wave of warmth spread through the cabin, Claire exhaled in relief, closing her eyes for a moment like she finally felt safe. Lila watched Ethan quietly as he worked, noticing the tension in his shoulders, the exhaustion in his eyes, the way he carried more than just cold on his back. "It must have been rough," she said softly, "being stuck here." Ethan didn't know how to sum up the last 24 hours, the storm, the silence, the forced closeness, the emotional weight, but he managed a small, tired smile. "You could say that." Lila studied him a moment longer, and something warm flickered between them, something familiar but long buried. Claire saw it too, and instead of stepping closer, she stepped back, settling near the fireplace like she understood this wasn't a moment she belonged in. Lila filled them in on what little information she had. The roads wouldn't be cleared for another day or two, the rescue teams were waiting out the worst of the ice, and the radio lines were down across most of the mountain, meaning they were effectively on their own until the weather shifted. Claire nodded calmly, but Ethan felt the weight of the situation again. They were safe for now, but they weren't out of danger. Lila, however, didn't seem afraid at all. She pulled out a folded map, spread it on the table, and pointed to areas where they could find better shelter or clearer paths once the storm eased more. Ethan leaned over the table beside her, their shoulders nearly touching as they examined the routes, and for a moment he forgot the cold, forgot the tension, forgot everything except the quiet warmth of standing beside someone who brought steadiness into the chaos. Lila's voice was calm and confident as she explained the terrain, and Ethan listened with a focus he hadn't felt in days. Claire watched from across the room, her expression thoughtful. Not jealous, not uncomfortable, just quietly aware that something was shifting in the air. Lila turned to Ethan with a smile that held a memory behind it. "You haven't changed much," she said. "Still the guy who tries to solve everything alone." Ethan smirked. "And you still barge into storms like they're nothing." "Someone has to," she replied. The heater hummed softly, filling the room with a steady warmth that finally pushed away the frost creeping along the floor, and for the first time since the storm began, the cabin didn't feel like a trap. It felt like a pause, a moment suspended in time where things could shift, where connections could return, where healing could begin. As the wind outside calmed and the snow settled into thick, soft layers across the mountain, Lila moved a little closer to Ethan, lowering her voice. "We'll get out of here," she said. "I promise." Ethan nodded, and something inside him, something heavy and locked, began to loosen bit by bit. Claire saw the change in him and looked toward the window, letting them stand there in their quiet reconnection, knowing that the emotional storm inside the cabin was turning into something gentler, something brighter. Lila's arrival had changed everything, not by bringing rescue, but by bringing hope, warm, unexpected, and exactly what Ethan didn't realize he needed until the moment he saw her standing in the doorway, snow swirling behind her, like the storm had delivered not trouble but a second chance. The storm finally broke the next morning, not with sunshine or calm skies, but with a slow, hesitant quiet that settled over the mountain like the world was catching its breath. And when Ethan stepped outside the cabin with Lila and Claire behind him, the cold hit his skin like ice, but the air felt lighter, clearer, full of a kind of relief he hadn't felt since the storm began. Thick snow still covered everything, weighing down trees and hiding the trail, but the wind had stopped screaming and the sky above the tall pines had shifted from heavy gray to a soft, uncertain blue that promised better hours ahead. Lila surveyed the landscape with steady eyes, already planning their way down the mountain, showing the same calm energy she always had when things got hard. She moved like someone who trusted the world to give her a path even when she couldn't see one yet. Claire stood close to the porch, her arms wrapped around herself more from thought than cold, watching Ethan with a quiet expression that held both understanding and something like relief, as if she finally saw him stepping out of his grief, even if only by a small step. With Lila leading the way, they packed what little they had, layered up as much as possible, and began the slow, careful hike down the mountain, each step sinking into soft snow, each breath rising like smoke in the cold morning. Ethan walked beside Lila, matching her steps, feeling a strange warmth spreading through him that had nothing to do with the weather, nothing to do with survival, and everything to do with the familiar spark he hadn't felt in years, a spark that had slept quietly under his grief until yesterday. Claire followed a few feet behind them, listening to the sound of their footsteps crunching through snow, noticing the gentle way Ethan leaned in to hear Lila speak over the wind, noticing the way their shoulders brushed from time to time as they moved around fallen branches and deep patches of snow, noticing how natural it looked, as if they had been walking together like this their entire lives. And instead of feeling out of place, Claire felt something settle calmly inside her, like she finally understood her role in Ethan's story wasn't to be a wall between him and the world, but to help him find the path back to it. The hike was hard, long, and quiet at times, but Lila kept them focused, pointing out safer ground, clearing away branches, guiding them around steep patches, and every so often she would look back at Ethan with a smile that held both memory and possibility. When they reached a lower ridge, the cabin disappearing behind them, the snow lighter here, the wind calmer, Claire took a moment to breathe, leaning on a tree while Ethan checked on her, asking if she needed a break. She shook her head gently. "I'm okay," she said, her voice soft but sure. "You two go ahead. I'll follow." Ethan hesitated, but Lila stepped in, her voice warm. "We can all rest a minute." Claire shook her head again, offering a small smile meant only for Ethan. "You're allowed to move forward," she said quietly. "So is your heart. Don't hold back because of me." Ethan stared at her, surprised by the emotion in her words, the honesty that carried no guilt, no pressure, just understanding. Before he could answer, Lila touched his arm lightly. "Let's keep going before the snow hardens," she said gently, and Ethan nodded, helping Claire stand steady before he and Lila moved forward. They walked side by side as the mountain opened into a clearer path, sunlight filtering through branches, casting small warm patches on the snow like pieces of hope scattered along their way. Lila talked about the rescue team waiting down the trail, about how they'd set up a temporary camp near the lower valley, about the plan to get everyone back safely once the terrain softened. Ethan listened, asking questions, feeling himself come back to life with every word spoken, every look exchanged. At one point, Lila stopped, turning to face him fully, her breath forming soft clouds in the cold air. "You really scared everyone, you know," she said with a half smile. "We didn't think anyone would be up here so close to the storm." Ethan shrugged lightly. "Didn't plan it." Lila gave him a knowing look. "You never plan the big moments. You just walk into them." There was something gentle in her voice, something both teasing and warm, and Ethan felt a small genuine laugh escape him. His first real laugh since before his father passed. The sound surprised even him. Claire, walking slowly behind them, heard the laugh too and smiled quietly, her heart settling with a kind of peace she hadn't felt in months. She had lost a husband, yes, but she wasn't losing Ethan, not in a painful way. She was watching him be found. When they reached the valley base, a rescue truck waited near the tree line, and the team rushed over, helping Claire into a warm blanket and offering hot drinks. Lila handed Ethan a thermos, their fingers brushing lightly, a soft spark passing between them. "Told you we'd get down," she said. "Told you I'd find you." Ethan looked at her, seeing not just the girl from his past but the woman in front of him, strong, steady, warm, and somehow exactly what he needed, when he didn't even know he needed anything at all. Claire stepped beside him then, touching his arm gently. "Thank you," she said, not just for surviving with her, but for letting her be part of this strange healing journey. Ethan nodded, and for the first time, he felt like he could let go of everything he'd been carrying, the regret, the confusion, the distance between him and the memory of his father. As Lila motioned for him to join her by the truck, Ethan turned to Claire one last time. "Thank you for last night. For sharing the heat. And everything else." Claire smiled, warm and sincere. Sometimes warmth is just a beginning, she said. He didn't fully understand the meaning then, but he felt it, like a door quietly opening behind him, letting the past fade softly while the future waited just ahead. Ethan walked toward Lila, toward the truck, toward a world that suddenly seemed a little bigger, a little brighter, a little more open than the one he had walked through on the mountain. Lila handed him a second blanket, teasing him lightly. "Can't have you freezing again before we get home." And Ethan shook his head with a smile he didn't have to force. Behind them, the mountain stood tall and silent, holding the memory of a night that had changed everything. Not because of danger or fear, but because the storm had forced three people to face their grief, their truth, and their futures. And for Ethan, the path he walked now beside Lila, warm sunlight beginning to break through the clouds, felt like the start of something new, something real, something he was finally ready for.